Hello and welcome. You're watching Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. US President Donald Trump has completed 100 days in office. Since Inauguration Day, Trump has taken a flurry of executive actions, including enacting steep tariffs, ending birthright citizenship, and cutting foreign aid. Trump signed over 140 executive orders. He announced reciprocal tariffs on all US trading partners on the 2nd of April before pausing them for 90 days. Tariffs were also imposed on steel, aluminum, and automotive imports. Trump claimed tariffs are good for the economy. But here's what has actually happened. GDP contracted by 0.3% in the first quarter as imports surged. Inflation is above the Fed's 2% target. Jobless claims are at a two-month high. The S&P index fell 7%, the worst start for stocks since Richard Nixon's second term in 1973. The dollar index fell 9%. Brokerages project odds between 40% to 65% for a recession to hit the US this year. Trump's approval ratings have slumped, with less than half of the Americans approving of his performance. At the moment, the Trump administration is negotiating bilateral trade agreements, and India could be among the first countries to clinch a deal. However, China continues to face tariffs of 145%, with no sign of direct talks yet. Trump 2.0 has already witnessed its first major overhaul with the removal of Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor. Remember, Waltz took responsibility for a chat leak on America's strike on Yemen's Houthi rebels. Secretary of State Marco Rubio will be taking charge as NSA in the interim. So what next for the Trump administration and India-US ties? Joining us now is Atul Keshap, President of US-India Business Council. Ambassador Keshap, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Always a pleasure to have you on Global Eye. Let me begin by asking you, the mood in the American industry today. Donald Trump has completed 100 days as president. There have been concerns among industry chambers. The outlook on his tariffs, not very good. As someone who heads one of the most prominent US industry chambers, what would be your view?
So, Parikshit, it's great to be back on the show. Thank you very much, and warm greetings to you and to the audience. Look, business craves predictability, right? If you're a CEO or you're the investment committee of a major global company and you need to make a $10 billion bet on where to build semiconductors or some other critical element of the supply chain, you want regulatory and tax and policy predictability. It is the most important thing if you're going to make a 10 and 20-year bet that impacts your job, it impacts your share price, it impacts the well-being of your shareholders, it impacts your company and your workers and everybody else. So I think that getting to that point of predictability is really, really important. And in this regard, there is some good news. India is looked at, I think, widely around the world as one of the most stable polities right now. And I think that what we need to do is capitalize as soon as possible on the potential for a US-India trade agreement that would give a very clear and strong green light to those investors that investing in America and India for long-term success and happiness is the best and smartest possible thing they can do. So I encourage both sides great success and great ambition to lock this deal down.
Right. Those hectic negotiations are underway. In fact, different members of the US administration have said that India could be one of the first countries with whom the US will sign a trade deal. How soon do you expect that to happen?
Well, who knows? I mean, this is where the two sides are working with great focus. You saw Secretary Besant's remarks that India may be the first one off the mark with a trade deal with the administration. I think that's wonderful news. As the president of USIBC, we've been praying and calling for that for a very long time. So I wish them great success. You know, there's a lot of rumors swirling about when the Quad Summit might take place, which is supposed to be hosted by Prime Minister Modi in India this year. I would very much hope that that trade deal between the United States and India will be finalized before the Quad Summit. That will send an enormous message of confidence to the entire world, not only strategically, but also economically.
Right. Ambassador Keshap, right now there is a lot of talk of having a interim trade deal or an early harvest deal in the next 60 days or so, 60 to 90 days for that matter. If there were an interim deal to happen before the full-fledged BTA in fall. What do you think would be, or according to you, should be the essential ingredients?
So thank you. That's a great question. I think that the investor communities in both countries, Indian large companies, American large companies that have vast amounts of available investable capital, are looking for reassurance from both Delhi and Washington about their plans for semiconductors, their plans for critical minerals, for energy, for nuclear, for pharmaceuticals and life sciences, for artificial intelligence. Ours are the two leading economies on earth for trusted collaboration. And these CEOs need to hear loud and clear from the Indian and US governments that working together in collaboration on these critical and emerging technologies is something that is strategically and economically desirable, and that their investments in each other's countries and in their own countries in these critical fields and with key partners around the world, especially on critical minerals, is acceptable. So if there is an early harvest, I hope that it would certainly be in trade goods, and it can help ensure even freer trade between our two countries. But it's that signal, that framework, that green light, if you will, that is the most important needed thing right now.
Right. US IBC, in a statement in early March, had said that non-tariff barriers and red tape must be dismantled because these are hurdles to business. What would be some of the top 2 or 3 pain points, according to you?
Well, this is where every country is sovereign, and every country has its full right to make its own decisions about its national happiness and prosperity. I certainly respect that as a former diplomat. It's very important. But what we try to do very respectfully and very constructively is convey the perspectives of our members, who are Indian and American leading companies and a few international companies from Europe and Japan and Korea, to give granular insight to policymakers and decision makers about ways to advance their own policy goals. So, for instance, India has made it very clear that they want more FDI and that they want to have companies build in India and make in India. We encourage and applaud that. It's good for our national security from the perspective of Americans. And so what we try to do is offer insights into how to smooth that out in terms of ease of doing business, speed of doing business, bureaucratic decision-making on key issues that companies need to face, and then also regulatory and tax policies. I'll give you another example. International banks are taxed at a higher rate than Indian banks. It precludes a lot of them from expanding more in India in ways that would flow more FDI into India for these various enterprises. Government of India has taken steps to reduce that tax rate, but there's more that can be done to ensure parity that would really send a signal that India is open for business and open for foreign investment and open for putting that money to work in India, creating jobs and taxes and so much else. So we say these things privately and respectfully, constructively, with a view toward helping India succeed and helping US and India succeed. We do the same with the US government because the US Chamber is 120 years old. It is an institution that was designed to be independent, absolutely a clear voice of business, and to be able to use that voice with government, not in opposition, but frankly to help fuel government success by helping it understand the insights of the investor and business community. So it's a privilege to be in this job. I appreciate the fact that we are able to speak clearly and independently. We don't take any government funding from any government, and we never have and we never will. It's a founding element and principle for us so that we can convey the members' perspectives. And, for things on like data, digital economy and the use of data, on energy, on life sciences, we are constantly offering inputs into both governments.
Right. When it comes to the average applied tariff, the US Trade Representative's Office has been constantly talking about how certain countries have been treating them unfairly. They've also been speaking about a high rate of applied tariff by India, whereas the US average applied rate is somewhere in the range of 3% or so. What is the benchmark, according to you, a sweet spot where the average tariff, applied tariff by India should be brought down, or what should be the bare minimum in any deal, according to you?
Well, a lot of folks have been talking about 0 for 0. At the end of the day, free trade, when it really is free and when it really is fair, is really, really good for companies and countries and consumers. Look at how much the United States has grown over the past 70 years after the war. Look, and a lot of it has been predicated on free trade. Now, I think there is a sentiment, and President Trump has articulated that our openness, our willingness to lower our tariff barriers has been taken advantage of by some countries that have not reciprocated. So I think that he's trying to renovate and update our approach toward the world. But if we can get to 0 for 0 with India and on the vast majority of goods, I think that would be a great thing. It's time to dream some very bold dreams. Why can't we do this? How can it help us strategically in an era where we face shared challenges around the world? Let's strengthen our relationship. Let's make sure that Indians and Americans are prosperous and happy through the entire 21st century. So I say, be ambitious, right. Revert to the real principles of free trade.
Right. My final question would be about American companies deepening manufacturing in India. We've just got confirmation from Apple CEO Tim Cook, and he said that in the earnings call, that a bulk of Apple iPhones for the US market will now be manufactured in India. And in fact, probably as early as end of 2025, all phones for the US would be made in Indian manufacturing centers. So this is indeed good news. But what does this indicate about closer manufacturing cooperation, closer supply chain cooperation between US and Indian industry? And do you see this happening more across businesses in the US?
So I think businesses are being compelled right now by geopolitics and by rising problems between the US and China to find different and more diverse sources for their supplies of items that go into manufactured goods. India is perfectly positioned to take advantage of this situation. It is a trusted economy, a trusted geography, a trusted partner. Look at all of the joint statements between the Prime Minister and the President that emphasize trust. And this is where I would say to Indian friends, this is your moment. This is your moment. Seize full advantage, but then also apply the instruments and levers of the Indian state in a way that is enabling and helpful to the foreign investor. India is complicated. It's diverse. It's a proud democracy. It has many, many layers of government, just like the United States. Everybody can speak freely. This is not China. It is not Vietnam. It is not some of these other countries where you talk to one person, you get an answer, and everything's done. If the Indian system, top to bottom, can realize that this is an enormous and historic opportunity, I think India can capitalize very greatly. But what the investor wants is predictability. They want an easily understandable system. They want clear answers. They want speedy implementation timelines, and they don't want surprises. I know of a case where a company wanted to move an entire supply chain to India. This was a couple of years ago, where they had seen the wonderful statements by the Prime Minister and by the leaders of the government. And yet when they got into the process, they were sort of being pushed toward doing things that didn't make it as economically advantageous for them. It didn't link closely to the port infrastructure. The project site that was being suggested was hundreds of kilometers away. So my suggestion would be, think with the psychology of the international investor, put yourself a little bit in their shoes, and then take maximum advantage of this moment of huge strategic and economic opportunity for all of the people of India, and hasten India's rise to being a developed country by 2047.
All right, that's a great note to end on. Thank you very much, Ambassador Keshap, for joining us with your view. Clearly, you are articulating that it is India's moment. Seize it, but also break down those barriers and think how global investors would be looking at India. Very well said. Thanks, Ambassador Keshap, for joining us once again. We're taking a break here on Global Eye, but coming up on the other side, US and Ukraine have signed a deal to share profits and royalties from future sale of Ukrainian minerals and rare earth elements. We speak to Shelby Magid, Deputy Director of Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, on the other side. Stay tuned. Welcome back. The United States and Ukraine have signed a deal which gives Washington access to Kyiv's rare natural resources in exchange for military aid. This comes months after US President Donald Trump and his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky had a spat at the White House, and days after they met at the Vatican during Pope Francis's funeral. This time, Zelensky has touted the deal as truly equal and fair. The deal covers 55 minerals, including rare earth minerals, as well as oil and natural gas. Ukraine will retain complete control of resources and decide what can be extracted and where. Earlier, Trump's demand that Ukraine must compensate the US for past aid was a big bone of contention between the two, but the new deal does not require Ukraine to pay back the US. Also, the profits from future mineral projects will be reinvested exclusively in Ukraine for the first 10 years, after which they can be shared between the two countries. The deal does not provide any formal security guarantees for Ukraine to future Russian aggression. However, it takes a much harsher stance on Russia than its previous iteration. It refers to Russia's full-scale invasion and states that no state or person who financed or supplied the Russian war machine will be allowed to benefit from the reconstruction of Ukraine. To take this forward, I'm now joined by Shelby Magid, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Shelby, thank you very much for joining us on Global Eye. Let me begin by asking you, how does this immediately benefit the US at a time when China has put restrictions and non-tariff barriers on the export of rare earth minerals, materials, magnets to the rest of the world?
Thanks for having me. So this is important for the US, and I would say also for all of NATO and certainly for Ukraine. This is a strategic move from the US because we need these minerals, these resources that you've mentioned, and it's helpful for our own national security to be looking at getting these from friends and not being entirely reliant on Chinese supply chains. So there will not be an immediate influx of these minerals, but it's immediately useful to put ourselves in that strategic position of getting this groundwork of these foundations and agreements going.
Right. So give us a sense of how this will function. There will be a reconstruction fund for Ukraine. 50% of Ukraine's revenues from exploitation of new projects will go into this fund. How much will US be contributing, and what will be the channel of investment?
You know, a lot of that will still be worked out, and we're just getting started. So what we're focusing on right now, especially in Washington, is the political significance of this. And so this is a warming in the US-Ukraine relationship that comes alongside, as we see, I think, a souring in US-Russia. There's a lot of focus on the peace talks and the momentum or lack of momentum there. As for what the US contributes, those specifics will be worked out. But one very important thing to note is that there was mention of future military aid, and that, as you mentioned earlier, it's not just paying back. This is now a forward-looking deal. And this was the first time the Trump administration has talked about future potential military support for Ukraine. So that could be a significant element that still has to be worked out. Packages still have to be put forward. Congress will get involved, but that could have a huge amount that would go into this.
Right. What's going to be the message to Russia?
The message to Russia, and I would say this has probably been a very bad week for Putin and for Russia, is that the US is committed to Ukraine. And there have been times since President Trump was campaigning and took office where that was in question. There's been a range of comments that have come out of his office and his administration. But the comments around signing this deal have been very strong and very clear. The US is committed to seeing a free, sovereign, and prosperous Ukraine, sees a partnership with Ukraine, and this puts Ukraine in a light that President Trump cares about. He is interested in economic benefits, he's interested in these minerals, and now he's even more invested in Ukraine. And so Russia should be worried about that because they've been trying to play play President Trump to a certain extent, and it's not working. He's fed up, so they're going to have to change tactics.
Right. Does this deal provide fair treatment to Ukraine over its natural resources?
It's a good question because there was a lot of concern about earlier versions of this deal. Rightfully, the Ukrainians pushed back, and I think they did a really good job, very professionally, very seriously, negotiating with the US to get to what is now a fair deal. This is more of a partnership. The words colonial had been thrown around before on earlier versions, and we've now moved forward. We're not there. Ukraine maintains control of their own resources. There's aspects of the deal that makes sure that anything moving forward aligns with Ukraine's EU aspirations. And this is all focused on their future and their benefit. So this is in a much better place now.
Right. Now, in terms of bringing this war to an end, what kind of leverage does this provide the United States over negotiations with Putin? And where does this place Ukraine in direct talks with Russia and in the war?
You know, where we are in the negotiation seems to change by the day. And there's a lot of frustration from the Trump administration. And I would say rightfully so, that they do not feel that Putin is ready to end the war and that he's meaningfully made concessions. But there's still this desire for peace. And I would say that's on the Ukrainian and the American side. As for leverage, the US has plenty of leverage over Russia. And that's aside from just this minerals deal. There's legislation that is being considered in the Senate that Senator Graham is leading on that has at least 72 senators, bipartisan, looking to put more economic pressure on Russia. There's more the US can do, and if they are invested in Ukraine and in seeing Ukraine as a free, sovereign, prosperous nation, they will need to apply more pressure on Russia. So overall, now being in a better place with the US-Ukraine relationship puts that in a more likely position to kind of move on Russia in that way, economically at least.
Right. Right. And Shelby, my final question to you would be, could this be now a template for future deals that the United States may want to sign with other nations on critical minerals? And the reason why I ask is because when you have things like rare earth magnets or lithium, the processing of it, almost 75, 80% to even 90% in some cases, happens in China. So do you think the US would now replicate this model with more nations?
I think it's a good question. I hear that there are others being considered. And so I think it's something that other countries should be looking at. And they should see that you can learn from Ukraine that the first offer that comes to you is not the one you need to end up with, but to engage smartly, carefully, and hopefully end up with something mutually beneficial.
All right. Shelby, thank you so much for joining us on the program, giving us your view on the very critical US-Ukraine minerals deal, which is a strong message to Russia about continued support to Ukraine in the war that has been on for many, many months now. That's all we have time for here on Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.